I'm going to talk to you today about work that we're doing in SIDI-Hub to describe trust management to an ecosystem operator. And I'll work through what all the component pieces of that are. There's two reasons that I want to present this. One is I would like you to find the holes and the missing elements in what I'm presenting today. If there are trust mechanisms that we haven't covered, if there are specific vectors that you would rather see augmented, I want to hear that now so that we can make sure we're representing across a lot of different ecosystem types and a lot of different technology types. And this is targeted at the policymakers and the trust managers, essentially the architects of trust. A second reason is that we want to inform standards developers of like what it's like and in across all of these ecosystems, being wallet ecosystems, login ecosystems, decentralized ecosystems, what the considerations are that ecosystem operators will make and what they have to look at in order to make sure that participants in their ecosystems trust the way it works. All right, so the context into why. So far, and the real reason here is to develop out interoperability. We've done a lot of work over the last 5, 6 years on the standards cooperating on this sort of first base layer of interoperability. That is that we know that standards that have been developed work for transmitting and sharing data across between two participants in an ecosystem or for issuing credentials into wallet applications, issuing credentials for a login. So we know that these standards work together. This second layer of this interoperability is really what we're running flat into in the United States. And this is the usability and user experience of these particular standards. Can users actually scan a QR code effectively? Is there a match between the technology that might already be at some checkout or some point of service and the technology that's required to read from the wallets? Because that mismatch is holding reliant parties back. Can the user, in fact, see the consent dialog when they drop it into a little tray for the QR code to be read and complete the transaction? And do the implementations that are out there actually encourage really diverse workflows so that relying parties can match it to what they need? Then the next layer above that is where SIDI-Hub is doing work right now. Can we describe mechanisms that are available to an ecosystem operator to communicate in real-time trust across the participants in their ecosystem? And how do they wrap those in conventions? How do they wrap those in requirements that are going to match the expectations of people in their ecosystem, participants in their ecosystem? And then on top of that, another effort, parallel effort on how you map from ecosystem to ecosystem, create compensating controls, and allow people to cross borders. How do you create that understanding, enough understanding that those conventions can be mapped? All right, so defining trust here, just quickly. Assurances that mitigate risk. Everybody in the ecosystem has risk from their own point of view. Consumers have risk, relying parties have risk. The question is, can we communicate trust? Can we set up the ecosystem in a way that's going to mitigate that risk sufficiently so that any one participant, most participants feel comfortable enough to take part in operations within that ecosystem? And some truths about ID and credentials, right? People live and work in different places. They live and work in different states in the United States. They get jobs or seasonal jobs in countries that are not the country that they might, their country of origin, where they have citizenship, where they have documents. They go to school and get credentials. So, and people have wallet preferences. They have viewpoints about what wallet they would like to use. And in a free market competition for best functional value within a wallet, there could be lots of players who provide value that those citizens want or that match what's happening at their favorite relying parties. Then on the relying party side, they have existing workflows and they're trying to fit like their customer flows across these different service delivery channels and context. They're trying to fit these new credentials into what they're doing now, um, or perhaps offer new workflows. But those do exist, and as along with those, there's different acceptance rules. So they have rules that either come from their own policies, from laws and legislation about what they can accept and the ways or the levels in which they have to accept it. So these are things that really add a level of complexity across ecosystems, because almost no one individual is going to take part only in one ecosystem. They're going to take part across multiple different ecosystems. So this complexity is really interesting. All right, now I won't spend any time today on the trust triangle of wallet credentials. We've gone through it before, but I am going to layer on top of this some concepts that we're calling trust vectors. These are trust relationships in addition to the credential actions that happen between the participants in an ecosystem. And I have some more on it specifically, but like we focus a lot on the reader trusts the issuer vector, and because that's been kind of simplest and the first one that needs to be established. But there's a whole bunch of other vectors that, in order to promote specific actions, if you think of it, the holder trusting the wallet application in order to store their credential accurately, hold their receipts, prevent profiling of their actions. All of these things are part of why you would trust a wallet application. A holder would trust a wallet application and potentially choose one. And you can see this play out in places where government trust is low, but there's a government wallet. And so there's resistance to that, right? So I'll walk through each of these in a little more detail, but I want to make the point that there are lots of wallet and login ecosystems where either the issuer at the top of an identity credential also provides a login system, or there's at least a trust relationship between those two. And some other interesting parts about this, like whether it's a wallet or a browser that the user is using, it's their user agent. So let's include agents in this conceptually, right? And same thing on the verifier side, a reader, a device, or a website, actually, or an agent. It could be an agent software that is doing reading on behalf of the verifier. So let's go through these now and talk about each one of them, because this really comes into, brings about who has to trust who, for what reasons, and then what's the functionality that they get or want out of that trust. These are the trust vectors, and the magnitude of these vectors is different, really, based on each one of the relationships and perhaps even individual transactions. So the issuer trusts the wallet in order to provision credentials into it. In the United States right now, we have one-to-one tight couplings between issuer trusting the wallets. In many cases, there's a state wallet, or they've got a contract where it's issued into specific wallets. So the user doesn't have a choice in that. Is that user choice of wallet something that you want in an ecosystem? How is the issuer going to trust that wallet? And I know there's a lot of work going on already to create, essentially credentials or assertions for wallets. The reader trusting the wallet. I talked about that one before, right? For credential protection and user authentication, right? There needs to be the knowledge that that credential was protected along the way, it hasn't been altered. And at that point of transaction, if the user is going to perform an authentication operation and express the result to the relying party, right? That the verifier needs to know that that wallet is a trusted platform for it. The user trusting the verifier, right? In order to consent and share ID, in order to get a receipt back, essentially, from that verifier, from that reader device. The reader trusts the issuer. As I mentioned before, this is the VICAL trust list that we have in the United States, and there's other mechanisms that are used to communicate that trust so that the reader can check the data as authoritative and unchanged. Overall, the ecosystem trusting a reader. This is the concept that's kind of given rise to registrars, right? The reader has to identify itself to the user over the internet channel with wallet credentials. That's required. it's not necessarily required, at least by the ISO standard, within the in-person presentations. Some ecosystems may say that they want to require that you must have a reader ID in order to, and that the reader is authorized, in some cases, that the reader is authorized to request this particular data, and the ecosystem in general is going to ensure that those readers are going to protect their privacy. User trusting the wallet application, I mentioned this before on the previous one, right? To prevent user profiling, improper receipt sharing, secure receipt storage, any violations of consent, retraction and removal of consent. These are the reasons the reader needs to trust the wallet. All right, so let's go into some of the component pieces of this. A trust element in this terminology is a verifiable artifact that could be received. They could be visual only, as in trust marks or seals. The user sees these. They could be the public keys that are retrieved from directories or ledgers or any other mechanisms. They could be certificates or attestations so that you can introspect and see, okay, this is the metadata ties this entity to this public key. I can potentially challenge the public key to see that the other entity is in possession of it, and the potential of smart contracts here, right? Where the inspection of what is being conformed to happens in real time. All right, and then let's look at mechanisms. So we're using the term trust mechanism. These deliver trust elements, and they're, APIs in some cases. They're just a mechanism. Well, it could be a ledger, it could be a list that's freely distributed. These mechanisms are standardized, and they allow one participant to inspect the other participant and see that they're conforming to the ecosystem rules and conventions. Now let's mention conventions, because conventions sit on top of these mechanisms to really configure them and give meaning to them. An example of one of these conventions in the United States, AMVA's MDL guidelines give almost 50 essentially requirements for the issuers to conform to in order for that key to be placed into the mechanism, in this case, a VICAL, right? And it may become as well a directory. So that set of conventions give the meaning to the participation in the mechanism and give it an inspectability, not real-time inspectability, but that meaning is known. If you want to picture this, right, this is the pipe sending the trust elements, and the convention gives the controls around the pipe. This is one of the tools of an ecosystem operator for them to express what the meaning of their conventions are, and then deliver trust elements or stop delivering trust elements for things that are within that and adhere to that. So some of these trust mechanisms that are distributing these trust elements, you could have a managed trust list. We talked about VICAL, RICAL, and these are essentially intact lists. A credential itself, a verifiable credential that shows the provenance, of the credential itself is part of it. A certificate or attestation that has that cryptographically intact metadata and keys and information about a particular participant or a particular component of that participant, right? Like a wallet unit attestation. Public key directories used in scenarios like passports right now, and ways, standardized ways to deliver keys. Revocation and suspension mechanisms that say whether or not something, any individual credential or any other trust element has been revoked. The concept of a particular revocation of a reader ID certificate is interesting as well, and part of the tools that should be available to ecosystem operators. And then trusted and secure endpoints as well. Those, essentially a known and discoverable endpoint from which that participant knows they can get trust information. Examples here, right? Like something like OpenID Federation being one of these. I mentioned before is like informing standards of work. So as we look at each of these vectors and the considerations an ecosystem operator is going to have on each of these vectors, can they create the meaning through conventions and requirements? Can they create the meaning to have that trust element delivered and that meaning delivered over the particular mechanism? So as standards operate, and evolve, can they go forward? So let's look at some of these ecosystem operator considerations. Again, keep this in mind with the complexity and the different dimensions in every open ecosystem, right? Where you're going to potentially you'll have credentials that come from another ecosystem and come in. You'll have readers that want to take part in multiple. All right. So then the ecosystem operator is going to walk themselves through a set of considerations and answer in a way that's going to fit the participants in their own ecosystem. They want to customize this to the way they want that ecosystem to operate. And if you look at different viewpoints in Europe and the United States about who is big tech, what is the trust level of governments, who are the purveyors of trust already in commercial spaces, right? Like, is there somebody already providing trust marks? So these are their set of operations. Can a verifier identify itself across the web and in person, right? Is there any correlation between the way, if I'm operating a website and then I'm going to deliver something to a person and check their ID again in person, is that consistently, am I identifying myself as a relying party, a verifier, consistently across those channels? Do readers need to multiply register? Do they need to go to 27 different countries to register? Can they register with one and have that go? Can they register in a global sense? So how these mechanisms are set up and how the standards evolve to give a mechanism that works has to consider these different viewpoints within an ecosystem. As I mentioned before, are there business associations that are already purveying trust marks? Can those become reader registrars as well? And does that make more sense within the particular ecosystem, like a free market ecosystem, for that association to be registering readers? Can that be voluntary? If you conform to Better Identity Coalition's voluntary code of conduct, you get a trust mark from them, or you take part in their list or their PKD, or their ledger. And also, do you really is it important to implement and enforce attribute access policies? Are you going to restrict particular verifiers and particular reader types ahead of time from accessing particular policies? Is that important in the ecosystem? Is that important for privacy regulations that you have or conformance regulations? These are just the sum of the set of decisions on the reader side. Similarly, on the wallet, are you promoting competition in wallets? Is choice going to happen just by reputation, wallet choice, or convenience? Do you want to spur more innovation in the wallet space, more match to relying parties in the wallet space by promoting wallets? So that an ecosystem operator looks at that and says, this is what I want for my people because my people want this. My wallet holders want this. Different credential protections, higher user authentication. Do you have existing mechanisms and trust marks and seals that are working in the business context? The Better Business Bureau in the United States, which has a meaning to people already, can they be enlisted by an ecosystem operator to take part in this because of existing meaning to people and leveraging that existing meaning? And of course, like privacy of the transaction, your transaction lists, receipt lists. How do you permit or prevent profiling or sharing? How do you look at this and say, well, if it's a loyalty application that's issuing a credential, that's going to end the context of which they're going to profile users because those exist already, even in some of the state wallet apps. So looking at all these considerations is a key part. Creating standards that are going to fit and make these considerations work as you go from ecosystem to ecosystem, and then mapping these so that at that top layer of interoperability, an ecosystem operator can create a map that says, yeah, I'm good. I'll accept from this particular. I have a control, a compensating control for another operating system. These layers are a key part of it. I want to say this considerations list, I spent time on it, is very incomplete in what we're doing in SIDI-Hub. And we want to be able to capture all of these as a template and a process for an ecosystem operator to walk through. Happy to discuss during the day and to discuss, to take feedback on this. You can drop me a note. Again, interested in holes, missing component pieces, missing technologies that could implement certain mechanisms, and then to hear from people who are setting the conventions on top of their mechanisms so that we can profile these and make sure we get all the considerations right. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time spent today and look forward to talking to you.